right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. We're here at Black Hat, and joining me today is Rui Ataide, the managing security consultant at Guidepoint Security. Rui, we're going to talk about ransomware and spend some time talking about ransomware negotiations and kind of the landscape, and Rui's going to bring us inside that process. So great to meet you.
Great to meet you too. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me. I think this is going to be a fascinating discussion.
Should be. Everyone finds ransomware interesting.
For sure. So before we talk about like some of the gangs that you guys deal with, a lot of my audience manages cyber physical systems, whether it's on the industrial or the healthcare side. And I know industrial ransomware really isn't like a specific thing. It kind of affects the enterprise network, and then there's a trickle over. But healthcare certainly is an issue. Just kind of talk about the ongoing impact of ransomware on hospitals. Is it abiding? Is it getting worse? What's your take there?
Sure. There's a couple of sort of avenues to that, right? There's the impact directly to the physical systems. As I said, we can talk about a couple of those. I think the biggest impact is just the sort of under the scene or behind the scenes operational and support systems, like, people not being able to schedule an MRI or an X-ray because the computers from the hospital are all impacted, or the backend infrastructure that supports that is impacted. As said, we've seen in the past in some cases where physical systems actually also get directly affected because they have older systems that may be vulnerable to certain things. And then again, we had a couple of years ago, not directly ransomware, but ransomware related, an hospital that had a lot of problems because their X-ray machines were based on Windows 7 and they were all still vulnerable to WannaCry, and someone 5 years later brought in a WannaCry USB disk, and then all of a sudden all of the X-ray machines started going offline. It became a pain because to rebuild those, it's a manual process. They need to go back to manufacturing. The manufacturers sometimes don't have a process in place to do all of those things. So we see a bit of that, but not as much as the effect to as said, the normal IT systems that support sort of the hospital services.
There can be kind of a logjam there with the manufacturers, right?
Correct. Yes.
And then these hospitals stay exposed for extended periods, unfortunately.
Correct, exactly. And then the fact that these machines are present on the network and they're not easy to upgrade, as said, right? The even just fixing the system or changing the system, getting a new X-ray machine, for example, it's just not a trivial process. And so those systems are present on their networks for a long time, and it can also be leveraged as a foothold to, further entrench and progress the attack, sure. Right? It's a vulnerable machine that's connected to the network, it's connected to the domain, and so attackers will find those and use them as a way of escalating privileges, of obtaining credentials, so that they can, again, not necessarily targeting them per se, but using them as an advantage to their ultimate goal.
So, and just to ask the obligatory OT question, we haven't seen any ransomware samples specifically targeting OT. Is it the nature of OT that works in its favor in this respect, where there's just too many proprietary protocols and systems to make it worth it for the attacker?
True. It's always hard to find out what the reason is behind the criminal mind, sure. But I would tend to agree with you on that probably targeting a couple of systems that actually the impact is more physical and probably raises more awareness and more attention to ransomware affiliates than anything else. It's not sometimes in their interest. I mean, again, we've had over the years a number of groups that specifically said they wouldn't target healthcare, they wouldn't target certain types of things. There was a lot of backlash when, some of these groups end up attacking children's hospitals, and we had that there'd been patient casualty and things like that. That obviously creates some level of bad publicity towards these gangs that doesn't help them. In the end, whether we like it or not, they do try and operate as a business. They try to keep their brand as clean is probably not the right term, but as appealing as possible, right? And no one wants to be the person that had to pay the ransomware affiliate that, caused some child's death or something like
sure.
that. So again, I think they're a bit cautious on that. on that side of things, to not raise too much attention to themselves, to not get on the radar of law enforcement for attacking critical infrastructure and things like that. We've seen some cases where the goal is to attack critical infrastructure and to get that type of approach, but it's not as much ransomware driven as is somewhat more nation state under the guise of ransomware, I feel, or we feel. So that's probably why you don't see them targeting those systems that much, right? We've seen a shift, for instance, in terms even of ransomware, of no longer sort of targeting individual workstations or things like that, right? Sure. They target just the servers or the virtual infrastructure where they can actually inflict the largest amount of pain in the shortest period of time. Again, we could talk about a number of stories outside of that, just in general. Again, we've had a case recently where they've pretty much attacked 300 ESX servers and all the entire infrastructure was down. And that was very crippling to the organization, and it's very painful to recover from. And so that gives the ransomware attackers a bigger interest, because the motivation then from the victim side of things, if we can call them that, is to really negotiate and get that decryptor, get that ability to be able to be back online as quick as possible, right? As you can imagine, if someone has even backup for 300 systems, recovering from backup of 300 systems, it's not going to be a quick and easy step.
That's the quandary, though, is you've got law enforcement saying don't pay. You've got the security research community saying don't pay. But the reality is, businesses are losing real money. Hospitals are not able to treat patients. It's a very difficult discussion. I mean, I'm sure you have some insight there.
Correct. It is. I think we all agree that the business model only works if people pay, and if no one paid, it would stop to exist. I don't know that it would really stop to exist. I think we would just be pushing those payments to sort of a less clear approach and less clear process. And so we don't tend to tell people pay or don't pay. We try to advise them on the advantages or disadvantages. We even recommend that people engage to try and leverage as much information from these operators, whether they're ultimately paying or not, right? Just again, to find out what information was taken, how critical is that to the business, and things like that. The recovery side of things is the critical point and the decision, right? Again, ends up being a business decision, right? Can you recover from this quickly? How much is that going to cost you in terms of revenue, in terms of operational costs? And we're getting some clearer messages, if you like, around those, where, again, recently, for instance, if we talk about the supermarket chains in the UK, they had very clear numbers of how much money they were losing on a weekly basis.
Wow, yeah.
Right? To kind of, again, the amount of money that they lost when you compare that to what a ransom demand normally is probably a magnitude higher than it would have been to pay that ransom. Again, their decision was not to pay. There's probably a number of other factors and a number of other influences there around why you pay or don't pay.
Yep.
But once you look at those numbers, right, if someone's losing $100 million a week and they're faced with a ransomware or a ransom demand of, even if it's 70 million, right, you only need to be down 1 week, and financially it's already beneficial. Now, we don't recommend anyone to pay 70 million ransom, but again, the math is relatively straightforward for some organizations. There's other moral and other implications that factor in, right? It's not just all about the money.
And I mean, I imagine there has to be a bit of empathy on your side. They're coming to you at a low point for their business, desperate times. Just how does that factor into the negotiations, et cetera?
Correct. So our goal is to help them as much as we can, right? Advise them, explain to them the pros and cons of each of the decisions, guide them through that process. Obviously, there's a lot of companies doing negotiations. There's a lot of numbers out there in terms of what are sort of the expected reductions that you can get on initial demands versus payment. There's also certain limits that sometimes companies are bound by, whether it's their cyber insurance premiums or amounts that they're allowed to spend, whether it's physically the money they have in the bank, right?
Right.
If we're talking large organizations, things shift a little bit, but we deal with a lot of smaller organizations that is the ultimate decision, right? It's like, how much money do I have? It's devastating. And how much can I afford to get my business back on track versus having to eventually close up, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the cost of recovery or not being able to access their data has a price to them, which is they'll have to eventually go out of business, mm-hmm. right? And so it becomes an easier decision to a certain extent to pay or not to pay. And again, if you have a number that you're bound by, then also makes that decision a bit easier, right? You have that ceiling. If you can get to it, and if you can get an agreement at that ceiling, then great. If it goes beyond that ceiling, and if it's a significant amount above that ceiling, then that also makes your decision pretty clear. Right. You can't afford it. There's not much you can do. You just have to walk away.
I don't know if you saw the keynote this morning from Mikko Hyppinen. A large part of it was about ransomware and kind of the evolution of it. And an interesting point he made was how a lot of these gangs establish a brand for themselves. Good. And it's in their interest to be upfront. Yes, you're going to get your data back. Yes, our decryptor works. Do you find that that dynamic still happening, that it's important on their end at least?
Correct. It is. It is very important on their end. And again, there is a lot of brand image that is clearly part of the process, right? Mm-hmm. Some of them clearly, even post or pre-post data just to show that they're serious and they're real about what they're about to do, which obviously causes some impact to both sides, right? Once the cat is out of the bag, if you can use that expression,
sure,
then it's never going to go back in, right? And so that it's been publicly disclosed. There's a lot of people tracking that information. Even if it gets removed, that was true and that someone was impacted. Obviously, you use that as leverage in the negotiation if you move forward, right? But you use that in the knowledge of the fact that it's been disclosed, so you use that to your advantage. The attackers do the same, right? They disclose them to say, we're really going to do this, right? And they understand the impacts. But yes, there is a lot of that. We've seen a couple of cases where there isn't a brand behind it. And again, our advice there is, in terms of the advice is, we don't know who this player is. So we can't really guarantee that once you get the decryptor that,
sure,
it would work. Or we don't know when they threaten to expose you where that's going to happen. What is the impact that's going to have to your organization, right? Mm-hmm. But the more established brands is very easy. It's very clear. They do have that sort of business honesty, if you like, right? They do what they say they're going to do because that's very important to them.
Right. So take me, I guess the first question, I want to talk about the negotiation process and just kind of, at what point do companies come to you? Do you ever advise against an individual company negotiating for themselves, like at the outset? I mean, again, just going back to that kind of overall desperation.
So again, we always advise that you engage. There's value in knowing what's going on. There's things that you can obtain for free that may help some of your decision process. Advising, again, it's a personal thing and a personal decision. I don't know that we blatantly advise against people doing that on their own. Again, we try to advise them on the risks of doing that, of not knowing all of the stages, not knowing what are the things that you need to do yourself to be successful, whatever that definition of successful is, right?
Right.
Successful to get your decryptor, successful in does that decryptor work or doesn't, who are you dealing with, any number of things. Obviously, again, it's a personal thing and a personal decision to tell someone blatantly, again, you shouldn't be doing that.
Sure.
It's probably not going to be helpful. They're in already a sort of a desperate state at that point in time. They're trying to get things to move really, really quickly, and they may feel that engaging someone that may not see the things from their perspective may not be beneficial. We do tend to look at things from the perspective of the person that's been affected by or the company that's been affected by the ransomware. But again, we can only provide advice. Ultimately, the entire decision and the entire process goes through the company involved, and sometimes through their cyber insurance and legal counsel, that we always recommend that they engage immediately for any number of reasons, right? In terms of whether there's a payment, there isn't a payment, there's data exposure, there's no data exposure. There's a lot of things that a company needs to navigate through in any number of scenarios. Again, even if you pay and the data doesn't get leaked, in some cases, there's some regulatory compliance things that you need to meet, right? If data has been lost, you still have to notify people, you still have to go through that entire process. So again, our goal is really to work as advisors and then, take the decision of the people affected and just supporting them on that process.
I mean, we've been talking about ransomware, but really it's extortion. There's the data leakage component that, I don't know if it's 100% of attacks, but it's probably close, right? I mean, there's that whole aspect of the threat of leaking whatever they've been able to steal.
Correct. And that is actually the bigger threat. The extortion portion of it is the bigger threat. And the biggest sort of, if you like, revenue generator for these attackers, right? Again, they can always rely on the fact that the data would be leaked. And again, they make all sorts of threats, not only of leaking the data and being public and how that would affect your requirements and whatnot, but also we've seen some threaten to share the data with or sell the data to competition, or to make deals of the details of deals public that could affect them and things like that. So again, the attackers have an understanding and do their research on who they're targeting, what is the data that they have, and they actually leverage that. We've seen them for instance, well, no, your cyber insurance policy says that your limit is this much.
Yeah.
So don't tell me that you can't pay, I don't know, 2 million, because we know that your policy actually caps at 3 million. Right? And then we have conversations around, well, that's 3 million for everything. You do realize that you just caused a massive impact and that the recovery costs are covered by that as well. So I need to have a portion of that money for my recovery. But again, they do their research. And yes, extortion is the biggest play. We've seen some groups that actually play only on extortion. We've seen cases where we kind of call them pre-ransomware, although that's probably not the right term. It's pre-encryption incidents or events where the target of the attack is able to detect and is able to take measures to contain the attack before the encryption event happens.
Okay.
But again, they will still get then notified by these attackers that they took data and that they're going to publish the data regardless.
Yeah.
We've seen a couple of groups that actually do extortion only and use that as a vantage point to them, saying, look, we were so nice to you, we didn't destroy your network.
Right.
We don't want to cause you any problem, but we have all of this data that we're going to publish if you don't pay us.
So a two-part question. Do these ransomware gangs expect a negotiation at this point? And I'll follow up with...
I think they do. I think they even have negotiation experts. The negotiation is handled by a different person, entity, group within the entire process. So yes, they do have negotiators. We often see messages that I need to take this to my leadership. Right. My boss says no. There is an organization, and there's clearly an hierarchy there, and there's different parts doing different groups within the ransomware gang doing different tasks within the entire process. So yes.
And how do the negotiations happen? Is it a text exchange? You're on Zoom. I mean,
yes. I mean, it's normally like a negotiation would happen, right? There's back and forth over a period of time. Most of these ransomware gangs have their own websites or their own methods. So whether it's a website, a chat on a website-based portal, or a messaging app that some of them tend to use, where you have your own ID that you can use to communicate with them. So there's a couple of different methods, but they're mostly around what you'd look at sort of a messaging type system, whether it's an instant messaging type system or through a portal. So there is a back and forth where, again, they'll send you links of data to download to prove that they have your details. They send you details about the ability to being able to decrypt files. So all of that negotiation through that process, there's a couple of steps that happen, right? In the proof of life, can you really decrypt my files? So we encrypted files get sent to these gangs, and they show the ability to decrypt that information so that they're capable. They provide a file tree of the data that was stolen and allow you to request a number of files that they can present to you to prove that they do have what they say they have. So it's a negotiation, and all steps take place on that portal.
These gangs have quite the business model, quite the infrastructure operating behind them, even marketing, I mean, to a degree.
They do, correct. Through a bit of what we refer to an affiliate process, right, where there's these larger brands and these larger gangs, if you like, that provide that infrastructure, that marketing capability, the encryptor and decryptor generating tools and things like that, and then provide those platforms. And again, provide also the rules of engagement so that the brand, is kept to what they expect it to be, right? Whether, let's say, they have a maximum on what a discount could be or what a negotiation could be, right? They will enforce that to a certain extent.
Do you identify yourself as a negotiator, or is that kind of like a non-starter with the attackers? Like, do they try to sniff you out?
We don't. Again, they always want to know that you're representing the company, and I think that's a trickier question to answer. We don't identify ourselves as negotiators to begin with. We normally assume a persona within the organization, which is in everyone's advantage. Having said that, we had a case recently with a non-name group where eventually we actually had to identify ourselves as a negotiator to say, what you're doing here does not follow what is the common pattern. So we have no reason to trust you and anything that you're saying, and therefore we're not going to advise anyone to pay you. Because, again, you're not giving us a name brand that we recognize, that we know that you are a trusted if you can call it trusted, quote unquote ransomware attacker or negotiator. And so we don't, but again, in the occasional situation we've had done that. I think, in effect, some of these gangs do realize that, companies are involved, and they know that they're dealing with negotiators. Correct. We've also seen a unpleasant side effect at times where rogue entities try to present themselves as the company and negotiate with the ransomware attackers a settlement so that they then can turn around and go back and offer a deal to the company that was victim to that. So we've had a couple of scenarios where we actually had to restart from scratch because there was a third party that interject themselves into the negotiations and started making all sorts of different claims and things like that. So again, it's a relatively standard process, but there are challenges and there are things that you need to be aware of.
Are you seeing organizations kind of stash away cryptocurrency for this kind of incident, or is that not a common practice?
It is not common practice, no. Again, we use sort of...
Just buy it as necessary.
Correct. There's a number of service providers that do that, including some of the legal checks that are required by governments to make sure that you're not, paying a sanctioned entity. We've had cases, again, where it turns out that it is a sanctioned ransomware group, so you're not legally allowed to pay it. And, again, they try to get creative and say, well, you can go buy Bitcoin yourself and pay us and don't have to tell anyone who you're paying. It doesn't really work like that. You're still breaking the law. It's still an offense, so not really going to work. So there's companies that provide those services and actually do all of those checks and make sure that, the crypto part is dealt with and things like that.
Do you see a day where regulation or law pops up that kind of prevents these transactions, this side of recovery?
We're already seeing some of that. The UK recently announced that government entities may be banned from paying these ransoms. I think we will see them. I don't know that. It's very hard to say, right? We're in the early stages of that. As I said, I don't know that that's going to be positive or negative. I mean, it does make the decision process for some organizations very straightforward. But again, I think we're risking, some of these scenarios where someone sets themselves up as a broker or a middleman and takes a car. And so again, eventually you'll, like everything criminal, I think people will find a way around it. And sometimes regulation doesn't necessarily help or enforce everything that the regulators or the governments are trying to achieve.
So before we wrap up, you've brought up cyber insurance a couple of times. Just curious, kind of a couple of parts here, or how much of a part of the reconnaissance that the attacker does is to, learn maybe the threshold that a company has with their policy, and just from the insurance provider's point of view, just is this kind of like the main incentive for people to look for policies is in the event of ransomware?
So the first part of that question is harder to answer, right? Again, I don't know that attackers do that always. I think it's whether they stumbled upon that information or whether they realize they have that information. I don't, again, it's hard to say. I don't think we've seen, from an incident response perspective, I don't think we've seen any attacker specifically trying to target or find where these policies are. They do take the data, and then again, as part of the process, I think they'll quickly do a quick search to see if they have that. So I don't think that one, I can't tell you, right? Again, not being on their mind, it's hard to answer.
Yeah.
But I don't think there is a specific targeting of that information. Obviously, if they have it, they'll leverage it. So I think that's probably the closer answer that I can give you there. In terms of people's reason for cyber insurance, it being ransomware, I think a lot of it is. I think the other side of that is sort of what we call business email compromise, right? Mm-hmm. Where, again, someone finds a way into a network or an organization and tries to defraud them by providing, we need you to pay this invoice, but provide a different bank account details or something like that. So again, I think hard to say, but I think the bigger driver for cyber insurance is not necessarily just the cost of recovery, but also the costs associated with cybercrime, right? Whether it's ransomware or other types of compromise.
Perfect. All right, Rui, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Fascinating discussion.
Thank you.